by Ben Montgomery, Kelly Benham French and Thomas French. They were here because of Parkland. And before that, Sandy Hook. Before that, Columbine. Outside, as the sun came up, kids wearing "March for Our Lives" t-shirts clogged the streets carrying signs that read, "Protect kids, not guns." These 21 strangers gathered inside, away from the noise. They had traveled to Washington, D.C., about a month after the Parkland shooting, not to march, but to take part in an experiment. They were victims of gun violence, and gun collectors, and cops and lawyers and hunters and teenagers and moms. They'd do a better job talking with a group of strangers than they had managed to do with their own families. Could they agree on some measures to mitigate the crisis? Could they have a productive conversation, or even a civil one? A gun, by its nature, is a polarizing thing. A gun forces us to envision ourselves on either one end of it or the other. Gun is an equalizer, a tool, a symbol of liberty and power and slaughter and loss. Some of the 21 gathered here saw a gun as an instrument of protection. One kept an AR-15 atop the armoire. A few kept guns strapped to their bodies, under their clothes. Others had been threatened with guns. They feared that guns empowered people who would marginalize or silence them. They had been intimidated, mugged, raped. They'd lost mothers and cousins and uncles and friends. They'd been recruited from around the country and across the political divide by Advanced Local, a media company that operates newsrooms in 9 states, as part of an audacious experiment in a new kind of journalism and a new kind of public discourse. In a fact-saturated world, could journalists create not just a product but an experience that might build understanding? They'd spend 2 days learning to listen, and then they'd join 130 others in a conversation on Facebook, that most divisive of American spaces. None of them was entirely sure what they were getting into. Here was Malik Wasna, 18. Before this experiment was over, a Michigan teenager a lot like her would be shot at while knocking on a door asking for directions. Would Malik's ideas be welcome? Here was Dan Zelenka, a lawyer and competitive shooter, who knew just about everything there was to know about guns. He came to teach. Would he also be willing to learn? Here was Alexis Intley, who could spot a liberal a mile away. "Dumb idiot morons," she called them, to their faces. The marchers outside annoyed her. She would never, ever, have anything to learn from a high school kid. What did they know? In a small room they sat in a circle, close enough that their knees touched. Group leaders coached them to ask better questions, to avoid marginalizing words, to think about how they naturally embed assumptions inside questions. "It seems to me that this issue all comes down to safety," said Matilda Wimberly, a retired educator from Metairie, Louisiana, who favors gun control. "My question is, what are you so afraid of? But that's offensive." She thought for a moment. "Can you tell me more about why you feel that you need lots of guns?" "It's the difference," a group leader said, "between asking, 'What are you so afraid of?' and 'What sorts of things make you feel afraid?'" Each person wrote on a post-it note one thing they wanted the others to understand about them. "All I want is to come home at the end of the school day. As a law-abiding gun owner, I am not a danger to you. I feel like I'm fighting for my right to be alive." Learning to listen, Alexis Intley hoped someone would insult President Donald Trump, so she could go off. She's from Staten Island, where recently she saw 2 people have a fist fight in a Dunkin' Donuts over whether the last episode of The Sopranos was any good. She's comfortable with confrontation. She was primed for it. But emotion? "I didn't want to listen to other people's damn stories and they're crying." She's a financial advisor, and in business, emotion makes you weak. She grew up in an "I'll give you something to cry about" house and a Republican bubble. "I never got a chance to know anyone else," she said. "Nor did I want to. I didn't care." She's pro-gun righty, but her niece and nephew, ages 10 and 7, are hiding under desks during lockdown drills at school. So something has to change. She sized up the others in the group. Too young, too liberal, too stupid. But she had asked to be part of this experiment, and she decided to give it her best. and the other members of the group shared their stories. And she listened, maybe for the first time in her life. She heard stories about PTSD, and rape, and suicide, and stone-cold killing. There's a lot more to this, she said to herself. Damn, man. I'm a closed-minded bitch. Deeply rooted beliefs. The conversation that began in Washington, D.C., migrated to Facebook, where it included 150 people over the next month. Alexis gave up Netflix so she could settle into bed with her laptop each night and take her role in the conversation seriously. Andy DiNapoli signed up for Facebook for the first time. Dan Zelenka checked his Facebook feed hundreds of times a day. They were forced to consider the roots of their deeply held beliefs. The questions they would ask gave voice to their prejudices and fears. Why is your personal safety worth more than mine? If you saw me walking down the street carrying a gun, what would you honestly think? They became reacquainted with what it means to participate in a democracy. Is the right to bear arms unalienable, as the Declaration of Independence suggests? Is this right endowed by God, or bestowed by the government in the Bill of Rights? With an eye on history and another on current events, they re-examined language they thought they understood. Security, militia, well-regulated, free state, in defense of guns on a warm Sunday morning, on the edge of street. Tammany Parish outside of New Orleans, past Rick's Catfish Cabin and Todd's Country Corner, Dan Zelenka pulled his Ford Expedition into an earthen quarry and unloaded a bunch of guns. My toys, he said. He pulled out his M1A1 Thompson submachine gun, his M1 Garand rifle, his German MP40, his Swedish K, his M1918A2 Browning automatic rifle, and his German MG42. He also brought along a few AR-15s, assault rifles, as they're widely known. The guns Dan and his pals shoot every fourth Sunday in friendly competition. The guns he wants to demonstrate and destigmatize, even as they have become the weapon of choice in mass murders across America. Dan Zelenka, a participant in the Guns, An American Conversation project, takes part in friendly shooting competitions with his buddies at a quarry in Louisiana. Zelenka is a lawyer who came to the project with a broad knowledge of guns. Ben Montgomery on Facebook. Dan had offered a lengthy explanation to the oft-asked question, why would anyone need an AR-15? Same reasons they'd use any other rifle, he wrote. It's the most popular rifle in America. Adaptable for many types of hunting, easier to shoot accurately than a handgun. If you have to shoot one at a bad guy, it is more powerful than a handgun and less likely to send the bullet through a wall and into the next room. Dan's nephew, JP, a high school sophomore, dragged metal targets across the Louisiana dirt, speckled by spent shells that twinkled in the sunlight. Time to shoot. At age 3, Dan wore toy 6-shooters to his aunt's wedding. At 10, his dad bought him a .22 caliber rifle for Christmas. 45 years worth of guns, he said. Dan likes to shoot, and he loves to defend the Constitution, especially the Second Amendment. We are, he said, the arsenal of democracy. His mind was made up. He was so resolute that some in the Facebook group thought he was a mole for the National Rifle Association. Gun crimes are down sharply since the mid-90s, he pointed out correctly. America has gotten safer, but we watch night after night the news about the epidemic of gun violence. The problem, then? It's the criminals, he said. He supports changes to stop violent criminals from getting guns. But he does not support restrictions on broad, ill-defined categories of guns. The term, assault weapon, means nothing and it means everything, he said, because the term is infinitely expandable to mean whatever they make it up to be. And every time they change it, it expands to include more and more firearms. If you really sat down and looked at the numbers, took all the emotion away, then you have to support gun rights, he said. He has known 4 people who have been present at mass shootings. two young women he met hiking in the Grand Tetons wound up inside a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, in July 2012, when a madman opened fire. One of the women took a bullet to the knee. 12 were killed, 70 injured, the largest number of casualties in one shooting in modern U.S. history, until the 2016 shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, which held the distinction until the 2017 shooting in Las Vegas, where Dan's old girlfriend had been listening to country music. That's 3. The fourth was his friend Steve Scalise, the Louisiana congressman shot in the hip last year when a man took aim at a Republican baseball practice near the U.S. Capitol. On Facebook, Dan posed and then considered the essential question: are school shootings the price we pay for a certain level of liberty? What we should never do is allow the criminal conduct of a few to be the catalyst for the infringement of any right protected by the Constitution, he wrote. Throughout our history, Dan noted, we have sent young people to fight for American rights and ideals. If someone began attacking our schools demanding that we surrender our freedom of religion or freedom of speech or right to vote, would we comply? I think not. Would we be willing to pay a price in blood to protect our freedom? Clearly, if history is an indicator, the answer is yes. On this Sunday, Dan coached his nephew, lying on his belly, staring down the scope of a German machine gun that fires 20 rounds per second. You're going to have to use some muscle, Dan told him. Pull it hard. Pull it real hard. Keeping the dialogue open behind the scenes, an army of moderators, most of whom were journalists from advanced local newsrooms, took turns in shifts, helping people craft comments and reframe questions. They nudged women and young people to speak up, and they gently asked a couple of white guys to quit hogging the mic. Helena Cohen Bloodman felt shouted down by Dan Zelenka and his lawyerly rat-a-tat-tat of gun statistics. So the moderators set her up in a one-on-one conversation with John Godfrey, a military veteran in New York, who was one of the 21 initial participants in D.C. John talked about living in a rural area, in a house at the end of a long, dark driveway, where police response times were not comforting. He told her about the gun he leaves with his wife when he's out of town. He put together a presentation for Helena illustrating the things they had in common: sports, dogs, grandchildren. I felt myself understanding for the first time, said Helena, a freelance writer from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Honestly, this was such an epiphany for me. I did not change my feelings about guns, but I understood that good, smart people could feel differently. 3 people got kicked out of the Facebook group. A few faded away. The moderators struggled with how to handle the mansplainers. Were people participating or advocating? Would pulling them aside help? Should they allow commenters to refer to undocumented immigrants as illegals? What about linking to questionable sources? The moderators read 13,500 posts and replies in the course of the month. The litmus test was, are people trying? Do they want to have this conversation? Said Eve Perlman, the co-founder of Spaceship Media, the firm that helped lead the conversation. If they are, we can work with them on the habits they've worked on over a lifetime. If they want to keep trying, we can keep trying with them. Journalists from advanced local newsrooms fed the Facebook conversation with facts and on-demand reporting on topics such as accidental gun deaths, defining assault weapons, mental health, the NRA, the Second Amendment in the 1994 assault weapons ban. Eve is a former reporter and editor. Her friends ask her what this is. Is it journalism? Why does it take a month? What is the content? Michelle Holmes, a vice president with Advance Local who spearheaded the project, said it's time to think beyond content, to reconsider the value that journalists bring to these contentious national issues, which are already drowning in statistics. How does this become an ever more important part of how we do our jobs? She wondered. It's so much bigger than the story. It's so much bigger than the product we've created. Brittany Walker Pettigrew was asked to help moderate the Facebook conversation because she had participated in another Spaceship Media dialogue on politics with Alabama Media Group, the newsroom Michelle oversees. Brittany found herself scrolling through comments on her lunch hour at her day job when she came across one that made her freeze. The post, by a white male gun rights supporter, was an attempt to answer the question, why do people need to own guns? It has since been edited, but it said, in essence, I need my guns like Rosa Parks needed to sit at the front of the bus. For Brittany, a 45-year-old African-American child welfare manager in Oakland, California, that post was so blatantly offensive that she had to sit down. She and the other moderators debated how to handle things. Was this guy racist? Should he be banned? But Brittany, channeling the spirit of the group, decided to talk to him and try to explain why people just can't bring Rosa Parks into all this. Brittany Walker Pettigrew, a child welfare worker, who helps moderate the Guns, An American Conversation Facebook group, works at her home in Oakland, California, June 8, 2018. Robert Durrell afterward, Brittany wasn't entirely sure if the man understood. But she realized that he had actually been trying to say something useful. And then, over time, something much more powerful started to sink in. I was heard. And I heard him, she said. And there's nobody in my family that has ever spoken to a white person about racism and not been killed for it. That night, she had a strange dream. She was sitting on her porch when an elderly black woman walked up, sat beside her, and took her hand. When Brittany woke up, she looked at the clock, 2:30 a.m. The woman, she realized, was her great-grandmother Rosie, who had been a slave. You're doing this for all of us, she felt her say. Sharing a secret, her teenage son sprawled in the orthodontist's chair, waiting for his braces to be tightened. His mother stood beside him, wondering what game he was playing on his phone. Are there guns? Asked Jennifer Brush. No, said Max, his thumbs racing through another round of Plants vs. Zombies. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. But you do play a lot of video games with guns, his mom asked. One, said Max. Like most 15-year-old boys, he was a master of ending conversations before they started. From another corner of the office, where someone was milling a crown, came a high-pitched mechanical whine, the perfect soundtrack for this moment, ratcheting up the tension. Max knew his mom had a visceral hatred of guns. She had never told him where this hatred began, but he understood that she disapproved. It's not entertainment, said Jennifer. I don't want him to think it's exciting or entertaining to kill people. Jennifer Brush and her son Max, 15, in Solon, Ohio, Thursday, May 10, 2018. Marvin Fong, the plane dealer. Marvin Fong, Cleveland plane dealer. She is 62 and retired and living in Solon, Ohio, a small town on the outskirts of Cleveland. In front of the Lutheran church, a sign reads, Choosy Mothers Choose Jesus. After decades in the Foreign Service, Jennifer was no stranger to the reality of what guns could do to the human body, to families, entire countries. She served as a diplomat in the Balkans, Poland, Turkey and the former Soviet Union. She oversaw the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Kosovo and witnessed the ethnic cleansing that led to civil war and the deaths of 80,000 Bosnians. During the siege of Sarajevo, she dashed through the streets as snipers' bullets whizzed past her head. All these years later, she was haunted by nightmares where she was back in Sarajevo. I'm still running, she said, still ducking for cover. For Jennifer, the defining lesson on violence came when she was a sophomore at Tulane University in New Orleans. She was home one night, making dinner, when two armed men entered her apartment and raped her. Today, 40 years later, sitting on her back porch, she chose her words carefully as she told what happened. How the men cut the phone lines to the house. Their faces were covered with bandanas. Her fear and loss of control. The gun at her head, the overwhelming sense of being treated as though she were a thing and not a human being. When she adopted Max during an assignment in the Marshall Islands, she chose to not tell him about the attack, even as he grew older. She didn't tell her colleagues or friends, either. But in March, when Jennifer joined the conversation on guns, she felt compelled to tell the group what she'd gone through. It was an opportunity for me to come clean on why I feel so strongly about gun control, how one confrontation with guns can change your life, she said. Two women in the group were stunned that Jennifer didn't buy a gun after the attack. But Jennifer told them that if she'd been armed and had tried to defend herself, the men would have still outnumbered her and would have probably killed her. In her view, guns do not protect us, even when we're holding them. Jennifer felt a connection with Alexis Italy, though they viewed gun control completely differently. And she forged a nearly instant connection with LaDaniel Boykin, a 25-year-old black man living in Denver. As a white woman, Jennifer had assumed that most African Americans would be wary of guns. "I suddenly realized that I wasn't listening to him," she said. He thought gun control was racist. As the conversation deepened, Jennifer read books on the history of the Second Amendment, trying to fathom what the Founding Fathers had meant by well-regulated militia. With fascination and horror, she watched a video of Wayne LaPierre, the executive vice president of the NRA, giving a speech in which he railed against left-wing communists and Marxists. Jennifer had devoted much of her professional life to fighting communism. The NRA, she decided, was trafficking in a toxic ideology of fear. "Who does the NRA think they are?" she asked. "Is that our well-regulated militia at home?" Jennifer realized that she needed to talk all of this through with her son. It was time she told him what had happened in college. She didn't want him to be afraid. She wanted him to be armed with facts, not a gun. As a Pacific Islander, Max's dark complexion had led some to assume he was black. Just walking on the street could be dangerous for him, she worried. All of this she talked about with LaDaniel. He believed that a gun would help keep her son safe. She believed it would only make Max more of a target. "I teach my child to be polite and respectful, and to look people in the eye and shake hands with people," Jennifer said. "That's the biggest security I can give him." Guns as leverage. LaDaniel Boykin liked Jennifer Brush. But LaDaniel believed that teaching Max to be respectful would not necessarily protect him. LaDaniel could no longer count the number of times police officers had stopped him for no reason. Once, in high school, he and his best friend were walking down the street where he lived when a cop drove by and slowed. LaDaniel bet his friend $5 that the cop would turn around. He won the bet. The officer got out of his car and demanded to see their IDs. Daniel said no and told the officer how the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution prohibits unlawful searches and seizures. "Your black ass thinks you're a lawyer, don't you?" LaDaniel remembers the cop saying. "I'd shoot your ass if I didn't have on my chest camera." By then, LaDaniel had been studying the Bill of Rights. He was tired of being harassed and wanted some leverage. The Fourth Amendment was good for that. So was the Second Amendment. Like the Constitution, guns offered protection against those who wished him harm due to the color of his skin. LaDaniel Boykin of Denver, Colorado, participated in the month-long Facebook group. "Guns make me happy, the mechanics of it," said Boykin. "I'd like to be a gunsmith one day. Some people would like to be a pilot. I'd like to be a gunsmith." Ross Taylor growing up in Biloxi, Mississippi, in a family of hunters. Daniel had been around guns. He was 9 when his father bought him a .22 caliber rifle and let him take aim at rabbits and quail. The men of the family would head out before dawn among the pines and live oaks. The first time he held the rifle, LaDaniel felt a little intimidated. But he also felt like he was growing up. In his family, hunting was a part of becoming a man. As LaDaniel grew older, he saw with increasing clarity that being armed could protect him in a racist world. At a rally in the state capitol, LaDaniel said, he and his friends came face-to-face with members of the Ku Klux Klan, who peppered them with death threats. In Mississippi, violence against minorities was all too common. Just last year, LaDaniel points out, a 30-year-old black man was beheaded in Jackson, Mississippi. All of these facts LaDaniel brought to the national conversation on guns. On Facebook, some pushed back, arguing that crime statistics showed LaDaniel to be in far more danger from other armed black men. LaDaniel wasn't having any of it. "I've never been threatened by any black males," he wrote. "Only white males and white cops looking to arrest me for walking while black." LaDaniel's perspective in the group forum grew uncomfortably controversial. He told the group that given this country's history of oppression, African Americans would likely never be able to trust the government or white people in general. The Second Amendment, he pointed out, promises blacks, like any other citizens, the right to protect themselves. Why, he asked, were gun control advocates asking law-abiding African American citizens to turn in their guns? "This is a side of the story that many of you just aren't considering," he wrote. "When you talk so confidently and strongly about gun control and gun confiscation, more gun laws," he said, "would not keep him safe. Worn down by violence, we live in the greatest country on earth," Andy DiNapoli said as he pulled up to the scene of a fight, where medics tended to a teenager bleeding from a gash on his head, where a crowd had gathered, where a tiny woman in a tube top began madly motioning for someone in the distance to come quick. "But, and I hate saying this, we're a mess. He sees it every day, cruising past boarded-up buildings and rent-to-own furniture stores, derelict housing projects and drug rehab clinics." Holyoke, Massachusetts, used to produce 80% of the writing paper in the country, but most of the mills are shuttered. The patch on his shoulder says, Holyoke Police, and his badge says, Sergeant, and the gun on his hip sometimes feels like it doesn't belong. He leaves it at work when he clocks out. Ask him about guns and he'll say, "I just don't care for them." He has seen what they can do. SGT. Andy DiNapoli of the Holyoke, Mass. Police Department says he doesn't care for guns. DiNapoli inherited his father's pistol and his police locker after his John DiNapoli was shot to death in 1999. Ben Montgomery. Ben Montgomery, barely 3 weeks after a Yarmouth, Massachusetts, police officer was shot in the head while serving a warrant. Andy passes the spot where his father, also a cop, was shot to death. John DiNapoli was running an errand in December 1999 when he volunteered on a disturbance call. He drove an unmarked car. He didn't have his gun. The corner of Hampshire and Walnut, a drug dealer turned and fired 10 shots. 5 hit DiNapoli. Andy, 30 then, inherited his father's pistol and his locker at police headquarters. A year into the job, Andy stopped a car with no headlights and wound up in a foot chase with the driver, who squared off in a dark spot. The men crashed to the ground, and the suspect reached for the cop's gun. Andy used his mace and fists and the guy got up and ran. For just a second, Andy touched his sidearm and thought about shooting the fleeing man dead. It's easy, policing a place like this, to feel worn down by the violence. Andy thought he'd try to make a difference, so he applied to be part of the gun conversation and finally broke down and joined Facebook. He doesn't have the answers, but he likes to help people. He posted a photo of himself in his dress blues at the funeral for the Yarmouth officer. He posted a scenario he had dealt with on the night shift and asked group members how they would respond. He asked them to go hug a cop. There on the cracked sidewalk, at the scene of the fight, the cops had the culprit cuffed.